this recording will cover Remains, the poem by Simon Armitage, in depth, looking at the big ideas behind it and the details. Remains is a poem where people can get a bit carried away with the background, the context of it, and end up repeating a lot of things about who the person this is based on is and the war that it comes from, etc., etc. Yet that's not really particularly important. Whether this is a real person or not doesn't really matter. There's also a tendency to keep throwing out the term PTSD as though it explains absolutely everything. What I would suggest with the poem is you think more about the impact on the narrator and the way that they are putting across their ideas and the experiences they've dealt with. The things it does in this, yes, it's worth knowing that this is a retelling of an actual experience, but that's all. That's as far as we need to go, and it is a poetic retelling, so there are choices made. That the conflict is a modern war, which allows you to compare it to some of the presentations of wars from the past that are going along in some of the other poems. And the fact that this is about a British soldier fighting in a land far from home, which of course brings in comparisons with things such as war photographer, not fighting in a land far from home, but certainly experiencing life in a land far from home at the same time. Right, so just remind us what happens. We start with a soldier who is called out to deal with looters at a bank in a desert country. We're not completely sure which one, it doesn't really matter. Now they are the occupying, or at least the policing force. Yeah, okay. So this is people, a threat to law and order, looting a bank. Okay. One of the looters runs at them. They appear to be armed, although it's not definite. 3 of the soldiers altogether shoot him, and it's possible they use excessive force. He then is casually tossed into the back of a lorry and taken away. Now, I suppose the importance of that particular section there, that particular idea, is the sense that what they're doing, bearing in mind, is basically their job, but they maybe are slightly excessive for, reasons, I suppose, that become clear in the poem. But that's not the end of the poem. The trauma of the killing stays with the soldier as he continues to serve, and then also when he goes home on leave. He resorts to alcohol and drugs to overcome it, but, and this is the key point of the poem, the guilt remains in his head no matter what he does, and he continues to feel responsible. Okay. So, as always, we start with the title. Why is he chosen to call this Remains? Well, as usual, it has a multiple interpretations that we could go with. First of all, and probably the most obvious, is the trauma that remains with the soldier. Okay, the sense that whatever he has left behind, whatever's been left behind, is what remains. But at the same time, the remains of the soldier are an important detail in both parts of it, both in the casual way it's got rid of, but also in the second half, that sense of the blood shadow, and then the actual remains in the soldier's head of the incident. So overall, it really is a sense that it introduces to us that it is not necessarily what happens, it is what remains after what happens. That is important, I think, and that's the sense that we get with this poem as a whole. Now, starting to look at this in detail, if we look at stanza 1 to begin with, we get this opening phrase, really, which immediately starts up the conversational tone. Yeah, many people notice it's in media res, it's starting in the middle. He's already been having this conversation. It's, as it says, one of a number of stories that they are telling. Now, I suppose that brings up an interesting idea. Are all the stories as bad as this? Okay? Or is he using it to underplay his true feelings? Or has he been building up to telling this story, which is the important one? It certainly belies the impact of the rest of the poem, this kind of casual way of almost just repeating and reporting an anecdote, really. But it's also very important that we pay attention to this line here, which of course is repeated later on, probably and possibly not. As I think this comes to the heart of certainly the opening, if not the whole of the poem. It's a moral dilemma. And that's why it's at the beginning. Okay? So you have a looter running towards you. Not, if it was possibly armed, probably not. It will be a very difficult thing. Okay, very different idea, very much more morally unsound. But here, it's just that fact that there is a possibility that he's not. But clearly, for whatever reason, it seems most likely that is. So it's probable that it says that this man was a danger. So I think what we're saying is the soldier's doing the right thing. Okay, what he has to do at this point. We assume that, they've made their presence known, etc., etc. But the key is the possibly not introduces that doubt. And that doubt is there to remind us that the guilt can come and the trauma can come from the tiniest little point and problem. The next three stanzas bring the opening half to an end as he retells the story in this very character that he has. The depersonalisation that he uses. As it says there, he refers to them as his mates in stanza 4. Here it's just myself and somebody else and somebody else. Is it because he wants to keep them out of the picture? Is it because of the lack of importance who did it? Or is this an attempt to distance himself in the retelling of the story? Now, I've mentioned here as well that the three of a kind bit makes clear it wasn't just him, that there are other people involved. Although it's very important to notice there is no avoidance of responsibility at any point in here. He doesn't, just because it's all three of them doing the same, he clearly takes it on board. We were all of the same mind, yeah? But we did it. We all did it. Okay? So it's again the way that he talks about it that's so interesting. The way that he is presenting it, his voice, which is probably the most interesting thing about Remains. Now, the details that then come through of the violence, of the horror of what actually happens, are told in this very nonchalant way, very casual, very calm way. Again, we're back to this sense of the way things are being told being as important as what's being told. But do notice as well, there's no attempt to hide the impact, to hide the horror of what's going on. In fact, the casualness on its own is kind of disturbing. We get phrases like this: ripping, inside out, pain itself, the image of agony, his guts going back in his body, which it deal very, very explicitly with the violence and the unpleasantness of what's going on. There's no attempt to hide the awfulness of what's there. I mean, the shock is clear in the casualness that we're talking about here. The fact that he's just reflecting on somebody sort of inside out and the guts being tossed back into the body. And those casual words, those casual phrases, sort of, and tosses, therefore remind us that the impact of that casualness at times is maybe more than the violence itself. The idea that when you're experiencing this, you can't process it. And I think that disturbing element of that is what's particularly important. Now, it's also worth noting, I mentioned earlier about this, it being a poetic retelling. When you look at that phrase, ripping through his life, again, that switch from the obvious through his body, ripped through his body, which is what you'd expect, to ripping through his life, hints at the trauma that is on its way. It's the first time that we see an element of this. What it seems here is that Armitage, using the idea that his life is being ripped apart at this point, as his body is, takes us beyond the physical into basically the metaphysical, the concept of ending somebody's life. It suggests for us the trauma that is to come and move beyond that casual tone. So we move into the second half of the poem, introduced through this line that always apparently seems to end the poem. Okay, and to use the apparent end as essentially the volta of the poem, the turning point, which is really only halfway through, entirely changes the poem. That's the point. This is the end of the events that caused the problem, but it's only actually the beginning of the real story. So he's playing with that idea of end and beginning to bring us in here. And the first image is this image of the blood shadow I mentioned before, which again I would deal with as one of the central images here. He's starting with the trauma, and this is the key idea of the trauma. Now, it could either be that the blood in our country here remains on the street and he sees it every time he goes past, and so it's like a shadow of the dead person but in blood, or it could be it's a metaphorical shadow and the blood symbolises the guilt. But however this is being done, it definitely reminds us, or effectively acts as a metaphor for the trauma. It does remind us of Macbeth, I suppose, to a degree, and there are several Macbeth references in here. But the idea that he cannot escape this moment in this particular place starts and works as effective metaphor with that idea that it's blood that is important rather than the memory, just the memory, the blood that sticks in. As we move on to the next stanza then, or actually the end of the previous stanza, with these three verbs that structure it around: blink, sleep and dream. Again, what I'm suggesting is, with the blood shadow having introduced the trauma, these three show us how the trauma is worsening. It's going deeper into his subconscious. It's going deeper into his soul, if you like, into his spirit. Now, the idea of putting "but I blink" at the end of the previous stanza, I suppose a little bit like the effective bayonet charge, kind of almost interrupts the regularity of the stanzas, because this does interrupt it. As though he goes home and leave, but I blink. Just that tiny casual little thing that then takes us onto the next line, that then suggests things are not as they should be. Another possible Macbeth reference. I'd also noticed that that idea of going deeper into the guilt. Blink, sleep, dream, of course, are deeper eye-closing things. Blink, brief, sleep, losing consciousness, and dream, going right into your subconscious. And each one develops in seriousness. Blink, and we see him burst again. Sleep, and we go back to the probably are, possibly not, the moral dilemma. Dream, and we go to the horror of what happens. So it's the structure he's using to try and explore that, the way that the trauma gets worse, the way that the guilt deepens into his subconscious. Now within there, bursts and torn apart, I'm not going to argue with you here that they are potentially more emotive than the ones that were originally used. He's torn apart by a dozen rounds. I know he had his life ripping through his life, but torn apart seems to me to be more emotive. And I think the idea is that what I'm suggesting is his memories evoke more emotion than the events. That's the point we're trying to get through. That it's worse and more emotive when he relives it than when he did at the time. I think that's what Armitage is trying to focus us in on. Now that, of course, brings us to the end. The last two stanzas, the last one, of course, just being a couplet, almost as though it brings it to some kind of horrible ending that's final, or maybe cut off in the middle of the retelling. But there are some quite high impact images in this final here. This one particularly, dug in behind enemy lines. And you think of the idea, that's almost like some kind of, that's what spies do, isn't it? That's what special forces do. They land behind enemy lines and dig themselves in, you know, rather than fight to push back enemy lines. So the central idea here is that it's so deeply dug into his subconscious that this is some kind of special forces maneuver. It's so effective what it's actually doing here. It's getting inside him. And that then brings in the sense of an occupying force, that his head is being occupied by the enemy. Probably and certainly when he's back being where it should be safe, as it says there, but certainly the idea that inside his head he is dealing with an enemy who is controlling. He cannot escape it at any point. As we move into the sibilance of distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, I would suggest that one of the things that potentially we could look at here is whether that's showing a change in his emotions, his frustration maybe, and maybe the point that, with especially the idea of sun-stunned and sand-smothered, you know, this is, and distant, this is, why was I even there in the first place? The first time in many ways we move away into any element almost of self-pity, you know, how this has actually hurt him and actually devastated him, rather than how his actions have done it. Up till then, I think I'd argue that although he's telling us the effect of the trauma, he's accepting very much that this is part of what he chose to do. This point seems to be an overboiling of the frustration. And of course it finishes with another possible Macbeth reference, so it's worth noting that there's 3 places here where we could consider the idea of a connection to Macbeth. Not worth mentioning, of course, unless you actually make something of it, and that's really to do with the idea, I think, of blood as guilt. And of course Macbeth doesn't have a happy ending coming. There is no happy ending, or as it says there, even an ending in sight, which might well be why it's cut short, that final thing there. It's a bleak, bleak end. There's no hope left for us here. So, if we think about the way that this has been put together, like so many of the other poems in the anthology, it's a poem of 2 halves. Just poems often seem to fit that way, where you have a volta, you have a changing moment in it. The first half of it appears to be about one thing, the second reveals a different meaning. Okay, not always 2 halves. With something like the prelude, it's a small section at the end, but always the second part of it is of as much, if not more, importance than the first. And that's what's important here. That's where the meaning comes. Now, the whole poem being in such regular quatrains, and we've got reference here to this idea of blink, breaking them, as we mentioned before, it suggests a kind of organisation and control, I'm suggesting. However, the enjambment builds and builds and builds as though it's beginning to spiral out of control. And I think that's something interesting. The idea almost of imposing control on the memory, but failing to do so. And then once we get to blink, the whole thing floods out and loses. It's still in quatrains apart from the final couplet, but it loses any kind of shape really at all at that point. Now, we started with the tone of the poem. I think we should come back to it at the end, that throughout, and even right to the end, the chattiness of the poem, maybe hides the true trauma, what's going under the surface, but I think it also draws us in as an audience, as though we are, and you could imagine we are being sat down in a pub with this guy, and he's telling us this story over a pint. But imagine the effect that that would have on us. A casual conversation in which I tell something that goes down this line. It probably therefore shows up the real horror of what's being experienced. And finally, this idea of it's in a kind of present tense, using present tense but referring to the past. As I say, my reference here is like footballers often do when they're asked about the game. and they say, I do this, and then I go through this, and I go through that. Again, it's another one like the chattiness that gives a sense of immediacy. He might be telling us a story, but he's placing us in that moment. And there's moments of things such as onomatopoeia that do a similar idea. So even though it appears to be a conversation, it draws us really right in there. And I think that's part of what makes it so effective to so many people. Okay, let's take it to the bigger idea. Okay, as so many, it's dealing with the impact of war. We see a number of poems that deal with different impacts, and we see several that deal with trauma. Interesting comparison with Bayonet Charge, which takes us through the trauma as it's happening, as opposed to afterwards. But also with War Photographer that deals again with the reliving of the trauma that happens afterwards. The idea that when you're living in war, what seems every day is horrific. But also that its impact after the event is worse than at the time. It's one of those poems that deals effectively with emotion. I mean, all of them do really, but there are some that work with emotion maybe much more powerfully than others. Things such as Checking Out My History and London, really the emotion is central to it. And I would say that's the case here, even though what happens is horrific. The real point behind the poem is the way that the speaker delivers it. If this was just written as a standard rhyming poem that retells an incident from a third person, it would have nowhere near the same impact, I think. The fact it's delivered in a style with language that actually sounds like the real soldier means that we see this conflict between the intense emotions that are causing the trauma and the way that somebody like this is attempting to hide and almost belittle their emotions to, I suppose, almost preserve themselves. This is another one that deals with the power of memory. I related it to War Photographer, and it's not the only one that suggests that memories are more traumatic than the events themselves. The impact after the event, I'd argue the Prelude does the same thing as well along those ideas, those lines. And that the reality of the war is being depicted here. Just like with Exposure, just like with Bayonet Charge, the idea of actually trying to show us and get us to feel the horror of what things are really like is central to this honesty in the depiction of war and its brutality.